Hi, it's Dr. Noseworthy, and here we are with the Unique Wellness Diet Series lesson number 2. We're going to talk about discovering your unique or your personal food code. First thing we're going to do is just talk very quickly and do a review of our Paleo Quick Start. It's a good idea to keep that kind of information up front and center early on in the process so we don't forget some of the details. And then we're going to move into making your diet truly unique. If you remember, we picked a general starting point of the paleo diet, but we said we're going to have to modify that. Now, we do have some clients that stick to the paleo diet all the way through and adopt that as their lifestyle because it works so well for them. But for most of our clients, we have to do a little bit of modification. But before we get into that, let's talk about how we make any diet unique. And we really do it by focusing on what we call the core four. Now, the core four is a concept that you're going to come up against throughout the lecture series. What we're going to try to do is take any of the main lessons or categories of things that we're trying to educate you on and boil it down to 4 primary concepts. Now, of course, any concept we can add things to it and we can do subcategories, but at some point learning can become very overwhelming. So we're going to try to simplify it down to 4 basic things. So today we're going to be talking about food as it relates to quantity, food quality, timing and frequency of eating, as well as the motivation behind why we eat, because these can all have a significant impact on how we're feeling and how we're functioning. So let's do our Paleo Quick Start review. If you remember, we said that we don't buy into this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all diet. Everybody is just a little bit different. Now, that means that if we took 10 people and just kind of reviewed their diets that works for them, we're going to find a lot of commonalities, but you are a unique person. That's part of our premise. And so we have to pick that reasonable starting point and refine it over time. And that's going to be based on how we see you reacting to total calories, certain macronutrient profiles, which we'll explain in just a little bit. And then also understanding your relationship to foods from an immune activation or a sensitivity standpoint. And we do that predominantly with elimination provocation strategies, meaning taking food out of your diet for a while and then at some point putting it back in. And in some cases, in some programs, we have the advantage of doing some food reactivity testing up front. Now, that doesn't always make sense to do right away. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We may have that as part of your program, or we may not. Now, the main 4 objectives that we're trying to accomplish in the beginning with the diet. Number 1 is to eliminate foods that are just pro-inflammatory by their very nature. So simple things like nightshade vegetables, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and peppers. Most of your grains, these just tend to be pro-inflammatory, even if you don't have really true reactions like sensitivities or allergies. We also want to make sure that we're eliminating the most probable food triggers from a sensitivity or allergic standpoint. And those at the big top of the list would be wheat and dairy, corn, soy, eggs, and peanuts. And I'm going to refer you back to some of the documentation that you've been given as part of the orientation and part of that Paleo Quick Start, just to remind yourselves of what these foods are. We also want to make sure that we're eating to control blood sugar and that we're not feeding critters. Now, we don't know at this point whether you do have critters in your GI system, but critters that shouldn't be there tend to feed off simple sugars. They feed off certain kinds of starches. And in the beginning, it's hugely advantageous for us to limit that because in essence, what we're doing is we're starving the enemy so that we can conquer them. Now, when we start looking at the paleo diet, probably the biggest mistake that we see being made at the very beginning is an overindulgence in fat and protein. Now, you're talking my language there. Sit me down with a big 12-ounce ribeye, and that's pretty much all I need for a meal. That's not necessarily healthy, nor would I do it on an ongoing basis. But really, I want to emphasize this, and I want to make sure that you don't miss this point, that the paleo diet, as we're executing it, and really a true paleo diet is predominantly a plant-based diet. It's lots of leafy greens and crunchy, non-starchy, cruciferous vegetables with moderate amounts of lean protein and moderate amounts of healthy fats. And every once in a while, we get a client that kind of misses that or maybe conveniently forgets it, and they go off and they tend to skew their diet and become very extreme, where either it's just massively high fat to compensate for low carbohydrates, or maybe it's really large amounts of protein. So we want to make sure that we find the balance and find what works for you. So just to reiterate and perhaps beat a dead horse, the paleo diet as we want you to execute it is going to be based around leafy greens and crunchy non-starchy vegetables. So it's a plant-based diet, moderate amounts of protein, moderate amounts of healthy fat, and let's go ahead and let's avoid the extremes. Now, before we get into the core four, let's define some terminology, because there are some things that we're going to want to know. You may be familiar with some of these terms, so just bear with me for a moment if these are familiar to you. We're not going to spend a ton of time drilling a lot of depth on these, but we do need to kind of talk about them. One of the things that we need to talk about is this thing called the body mass index. This is a test or a measure that's commonly used in health-related lectures and pamphlets and websites as a marker for, say, obesity or health and wellness, with the theory being that the higher your BMI is, the less healthy you are. Now, this is very simply based on a calculation of your height and your weight. We'll talk about why that's not a good idea in just a moment. Now, we also have another measure called the BMR. This is called your basal metabolic rate. And as you'll see in a moment, this tells us how many calories you would burn if you just laid in bed all day. And then we also have what's called the lean body mass, and this is the total mass of your muscles and your bone and your connective tissue like ligaments and tendons. And what's left over, of course, is your body fat. So we can express that as a body fat percentage, which would be a percentage of your total body weight. And then we have terms like macronutrients and micronutrients. So let's do just a little short discussion on each of these just to make sure that we don't have anything that we need to clarify. So let's talk about this body mass index. As I mentioned, it's really not my favorite marker. In fact, I think it's almost useless because it's based strictly on height and weight calculations, and it doesn't take into effect things like muscle mass. So for example, you can have two people that are 5'7" tall and they both weigh 175 pounds. And if one is mostly athletic, lean, and muscular and the other is not, their BMI is going to be completely identical because it's based on height and weight, but it doesn't take into account the differences in their physique. And as a general rule, two people with the same BMI, where one is more muscular, more active, and more fit, they're going to be healthier than someone who has the same BMI but maybe has more body fat and has less muscle mass. And I think that that's a very simple concept. So don't place too much emphasis on this. If you go out on the website and do some searching on things like BMR or BMI, you're going to come up with all kinds of calculators. Just don't put a lot of emphasis on it. And if you fall slightly above or below what's considered the normal range, and I'm not even going to share those numbers because I don't believe they have any value, again, easily and readily available for if you want to look at that. But if you find that you're just a little bit above or below, don't worry about that. That's probably going to change, and this really isn't very much of a telling marker anyways. Now, what does help us more is this thing called the BMR, or the basal metabolic rate, and it truly is how many calories you burn at rest. And in fact, when you look at the total calories that you burn in the run of a day, about 70% of your total caloric needs are used in basal metabolism, those things that just go on regardless of what your activity rates are. Now, there are calculations, and I'll show you a screenshot of a mathematical formula in just a minute to see how these things are calculated. But when you look at your basal metabolic rate, that's the bare minimum that you need for, say, survival. It doesn't mean that you're going to die if you eat less than that. In fact, studies show that if you eat below your BMR, then the intelligence of the body will adjust your metabolic rate and your metabolism lower to match what your caloric intake is. And this is really a conservation or a survival strategy. And it's one of several reasons why some people can gain weight on low-calorie diets. If you are hypocaloric for long enough a period of time, your metabolism will adjust to adapt to that. Now, the BMR is based on gender, it's based on age, and it's based on height and weight, and it can be used to calculate your total caloric needs, which we'll go through a simple exercise a little bit later. But here's one of several different mathematical equations, and you can find this on Wikipedia. Just type in BMR and you'll get a nice little article that will show you 3 or 4 equations. But regardless of which equation you use, and I'm not asking you to do the math, there are plenty of calculators out there, including myfitnesspal.com, which will do that. All you have to do is Google BMR and you'll come up with a plethora of places that will do this calculation for you. But there are probably 3 generally accepted formulas that vary only slightly from each other. So it really doesn't matter which one you use, or if you pick one calculator on the internet versus another one, whether it's myfitnesspal.com or not, doesn't really matter, because you'll come up with the same ballpark. And as I'll show you in just a moment, these are really just estimates. Now, let's talk about lean body mass and body fat. Remember, we've just talked about the BMI. It's kind of useless. The BMR has utility. We want to know what that is. We have the lean body mass and the body fat percentage. So let's define these. Lean body mass is muscle, bone, connective tissue, etc., as we've already defined. But let's talk a little bit more about body fat, because we can divide that into two different compartments, if you will. One compartment is what we call visceral fat. That is the fat that surrounds your internal organs. So wrapped around your intestines, wrapped around your lungs, wrapped around your liver and your gallbladder, there are layers of fat. And some people have more visceral fat than others. And unfortunately, visceral fat is that which is more associated with things like diseases related to obesity. And in fact, you may have very little subcutaneous fat, which is the fat found directly under the skin. And that's the one most of us want to lose, the one that kind of contributes to, the beer belly or the muffin top, or, whatever the common terminology is for these days. But the subcutaneous fat, while aesthetically not nice to see, doesn't have the same direct correlation to obesity. Now, in reality, we want to make sure that we're minimizing body fat, but yeah, we need it. Body fat is actually there for a particular reason. We just want to make sure that it's reasonable and that it's under control. So we have our lean body mass, we have our body fat, which is divided between visceral fat and subcutaneous. And another sidebar, just a little bit of a tidbit here, is that your visceral fat is a little bit easier to lose than the subcutaneous fat. And so if you're working out, or in the past, if you've been trying to lose the last 10 pounds or what have you, sometimes the visceral fat is the last part to go, because you're losing the internal visceral fat first. I'm sorry, I think I said that wrong. The subcutaneous fat is what goes last. The visceral fat goes first. And that's actually a good thing, again, because of the connection between the visceral fat and things like heart disease and things that nobody wants to get. Now, your total body weight, therefore, is your lean body mass plus your fat mass. And that should make sense, right? You sum up all the different types of tissues in your body and you get your total body weight. And when we start talking about how much food we need, which we'll break that down in more detail momentarily, the amount of calories that you eat every day should support your lean body mass, but not support fat accumulation. And in the exception, or with the exception of people like most of my clients that have metabolic issues, let's say that we can put that off to the side for the moment. If we see somebody who has an excess of body fat accumulation, that would give us an idea that there's a big mismatch between their caloric expenditure and what they're taking in. And so, there's an excess there that needs to be balanced. Now, most of my clients have metabolic issues. And so the very simple equation of calories in, calories out doesn't really hold when there's a metabolic problem, whether that is chronic infections or hormone imbalances or blood sugar problems or leaky gut. These things mess up that simple calories in, calories out equation. And we quite often find people that are eating reasonable diets with good caloric intake, and they're working out and they're producing a lot of effort that burns calories throughout the day, yet they're still not losing weight. In some cases, the harder they try, the more fat they put on. That's a metabolic problem. But for the most part, again, just for the big picture here, we want to make sure that your caloric intake supports your lean body mass and not a fat accumulation. Now, further terminology, we have micronutrients, and these are your vitamins and minerals, things like calcium, magnesium, B12, vitamin D, that kind of thing. And these are predominantly going to come from fruits and vegetables. If we're executing a paleo diet well and we're using good quality foods, we should have adequate intake of micronutrients. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use a vitamin and mineral supplement. And in fact, a lot of the supplements that we use to correct abnormal physiology with our clients often have vitamin and minerals as cofactors, and a lot of times we'll use some formulas that actually act as your multivitamin, multimineral, but we don't want to rely on that at all. It should be an insurance policy. If you take a multivitamin, it shouldn't be something where you're compensating for bad dietary choices and you didn't eat too well that day, so you take a couple of more vitamins just to try to compensate. If we're doing that, we're probably making a decision that's not the best in the long run at some level. Now, meat also contains some vitamins and minerals, but not enough really that we can kind of count on that. So we still need some plant and vegetation basis to our diet. And again, it should be the predominance. We'll get to it in just a little bit, but when you look at any plate, when you're eating your meals, probably about a half to 2/3 of your plate should be full of leafy greens or crunchy, non-starchy vegetables. That would be a good, adequate serving size. Now, in terms of these micronutrients, a lot of times our clients come in and they're very concerned about things like nutrient deficiencies, and they think their diet is deficient. And I will tell you unequivocally that nutrient deficiencies are fairly rare unless you're really in poverty states, especially with the standard American diet where everything is fortified because the manufacturing process tends to strip everything out. But nutrient deficiencies usually mean that someone has made a dietary choice that for whatever reason depletes them of a nutrient or deprives them of that. So for example, vegans, because they choose not to eat animal meat, are not going to have a B12 source because we get all of our B12 from animal protein. And so a true and a well-executed vegan diet, which can be very healthy for some people, has to have a B12 source outside of animal protein. And that's a skewed dietary choice rather than kind of a natural deficiency, so to speak. But I would say the vast majority of cases with our clients, if there is a nutrient deficiency, we're concerned about it, usually means that there's some kind of a malabsorption. There's something going on in the gut, be that food reactions and sensitivities or infections or leaky gut. There are many things that can produce that. But usually if we come to the conclusion that there is a nutrient deficiency, we're usually dealing with the gut and fixing that. So we may give a nutrient in the short term just to make sure that it's there and doing its job. But the bigger game to play, of course, is to find the issue with the gut and try to fix that. Now, what about macronutrients? So macro means big, micro means small, and so we're talking here about protein, fats, and carbohydrates. Protein just very simply used to build and repair tissues and cells, but protein can also be used as an energy source. In fact, some people are very good at utilizing what we might call alternative fuel sources. Carbohydrates are our primary fuel source, but again, some people are very good at breaking down proteins and even breaking down fats and using those for fuel. And these are people who do extremely well on low carbohydrate diets. But again, that's not everyone, and it may be you and it may not be you. We're going to go through a discovery process over the next several weeks, perhaps even months, to try to figure that out. Carbohydrates then are our primary fuel source. But there's really a double-edged sword here that plays off your brain versus weight gain, because your brain needs a certain amount of carbohydrates to work well. And we have some standards that we shoot for, but again, some people do well with less, some people need a little bit more. The problem is that we can go too low and cause problems, but if we go too high, carbohydrate intake beyond what we actually need and can metabolize efficiently really leads into weight gain, and it's the weight gain that's highly unfavorable. It's that visceral fat and the subcutaneous fat that we really don't want. And then we have the third and final macronutrient, which is fat, and that is not just a fuel source. It actually is part of your cellular membrane, and that's all cells. Your brain is mostly fat or lipids. And as we mentioned before, some people are very efficient at burning fats for energy. Now, these macronutrients need to be balanced, and we don't really want to see these kind of wacky diets where it's all one and none of the other, or we exclude an entire food group for whatever reason. But we have to take that balanced starting point and then over time tune it to you and to your uniqueness. So let's break down the protein section just a little bit more. Where does the protein come from? Well, you can get some from plants, but there's not all that much. So animal sources, meats and fish, are going to be your best bet because that's the easiest way to get your protein levels up to an adequate amount. And so on average, a piece of meat or a piece of fish that's about the size of the palm of your hand, and let's say an average sized person, that's going to be somewhere around 3 ounces of animal protein. It's going to represent 25 to 30 grams. Now, what we're going to try to do is we're going to define some of these parameters, and then we're going to help you understand the ballpark that you need to be in with your total calories as well as your macronutrients. And we may not get it right at the very beginning, and these are just estimates and guidelines, as we've already mentioned. But animal protein is going to be your best source. Serving size, about the size of your hand, maybe 3 ounces, going to be 25 to 30 grams. Now, we'll show you in a moment that the larger you are, the more muscle you have, the more physically active you are, the more you need. And so it's based on things like your body size and your activity level. Now, further now, when we look at that, in fact, this is what we were just saying, is the amount of protein that I need, being about 200 pounds and being fairly muscled and physically active. I like to lift weights and I like to lift heavy weights. I'm going to need more protein than someone who weighs maybe 50 pounds less than I do, doesn't have as much muscle, and isn't into moderate to intense exercise, right? That's just the reality. So how much protein you need is really based on you as an individual, based on your body mass, your lean body mass, and based on your activity level. And these are just some guidelines. Don't worry about doing any calculations right now. We're going to kind of guide you through that process a little bit later and show you how to do that. But if you're sedentary or exercising very lightly, then you need quite a bit less than if you're exercising moderately, or we could say that if you have a lot more muscle mass. So again, these are just some guidelines to think about, and we'll be helping you do some calculations. Well, when it comes to carbohydrates, now clearly there are some better choices that we can make. The sources of carbohydrates that we really like to use are leafy greens, these non-starchy vegetables, and then small servings of fruits and berries. And if you go back and refer to your prior documentation, we like you to keep it to 2 servings of fruit and or berries per day. And ideally one of those 2 would be some kind of a mixed berry blend like blackberries and blueberries and raspberries, because of the fiber content, the nutrient content, and they tend to have a much lower impact on your blood sugar. But there are, of course, your starchy vegetables, and some of these can be favorable. The ones that we want to omit right now would be things like white potatoes, because that's a nightshade, tends to be pro-inflammatory. But the favorable starches, again, look at your documentation, would be things like sweet potatoes and rutabagas and turnips and yams and those kind of things. Now, of course, you can completely mess it up by preparing it wrong and using all kinds of brown sugar and maybe marshmallow like you might see around Thanksgiving. But, that's just taking something that's good and going crazy with it. But for the most part, we want to minimize or completely eliminate the starchy vegetables as we eliminate grains as well as beans and legumes. Now, again, over time, we can add some things back in, but we have to accomplish a couple of things before we get to the provocation stage, or we start playing around with different forms of carbohydrates that are on the lower end of this scale that are not the better choices that we have highlighted here in yellow. And what we're looking for is we're looking for functional stability, we're looking for control of your symptoms and your complaints and improved quality of life. And predominantly, we're looking to make sure that your gut environment is working well, because that's where a lot of these reactions are being generated from. So these are your sources. Well, how much do you need? Well, this is where the brain comes in again. As we said that we said carbohydrates are your primary fuel source. And for most people, their brains need about 100 to 125 grams of carbs per day to work well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some people are completely fine with less than that. We have clients that are very efficient at these alternative fuels, meaning protein and fat, and they can thrive and do very well on 40 or 50 grams of carbs per day. Others fall apart. They have no energy, their brain doesn't work, and we have to get the carbs up just because that's their unique physiology. And beyond that, intense exercise, and I want to highlight the word intense, requires more carbohydrates, sometimes up as much as 1 gram per pound of body weight. So, if I'm 200 pounds again and I'm working out very, very hard, I need to replenish my energy sources, which are stored into muscles in what's called glycogen. And I may have to eat on heavy workout days. I may have to eat 200 grams of carbohydrates, even though I tend to be one of those people who really thrives and does fairly well on a low carbohydrate diet. But again, these are just some guidelines. And so we'll start with that 100 to 125 grams per day. And I have a graphic in just a moment that will show you how easy it is to hit that target. It may seem like a big number, but it really isn't. But here's a way that we can check to see whether or not carbs are too high or too low. And we'll be checking in with you on our individual sessions just to make sure that we're following along and trying to get this right from the get-go. If your carbs are too low, typically you're going to experience low energy and a bad brain. You're going to have brain fog, focus and concentration issues. Maybe your memory's not working. Now, low carbohydrates are not the only reasons you can have those things, but it's one of the easiest things to fix if that's the problem or if it's part of the problem. Now, carbs can be too high. And as we mentioned earlier, that can lead to fat accumulation, right? So your body fat goes up. That becomes a problem because body fat tends to be in and of itself pro-inflammatory and can skew your hormones. But carbs too high drives this thing called insulin resistance, which develops over time into a pre-diabetic and diabetic state. But even with high carbs, you can also have low energy and bad brain function. So again, there's a balance, and there will tend to be a sweet spot where your carbohydrate intake is optimized and you're balancing the rest of your nutrients with protein and with fat. And then those three things mixed together are creating a hormonal environment that really works quite well for your body, and that is going to be unique to you. So let me show you how easy it is to get this 100 to 125 grams of carbs per day. We're going to break this down just between our non-starchy vegetables and build it up. So let's say that we want to shoot for 25 to 50 grams per day with non-starchy leafy greens. So that's very easy to do. You can just, if you're making a protein smoothie, which a lot of our clients do throughout our program, all you have to do is just take a handful of greens and toss that in the bottom of the blender before you throw in, say, your protein powders and whatever other mixtures you're using, and some berries. And on top of that, if in addition to that handful of greens, you're also having either a large salad every day, perhaps for lunch, or either with lunch or dinner or snacking throughout the day, if you're having a total of 1 to 2 cups of broccoli or cauliflower or green beans or some other kind of non-starchy vegetable, then you're going to get up to 50 grams of carbs. So between 100 and 125 is our target, and you can get 25 to 50 just by having greens in your smoothie and eating a large salad every day. So that's pretty easy. Now, we also ask you to limit your fruit and berries to 2 servings, but even with 2 servings, you can get up to another 50 grams of carbs. So for an example, a medium-sized apple is going to have about 20 grams of good, healthy carbohydrates, as would a pear and other similar single serving size fruits. And you can complement that with 1 to 2 cups of mixed berries. I like to use frozen berries. I use a triple berry blend of blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries in my protein shakes every day. And so I get, again, 35 to 50 grams. I typically have an apple, sometimes a plum, sometimes a pear, with 1 or 2 cups of frozen berries throughout the day. And so just with those 2 things, if we're topping out at the upper end, we're already at 100 grams of carbs. And many people, that's all they need. Now, if somebody needs a little bit more, we can add in a serving of favorable starch. And that's going to be anywhere from 20 to 40 grams of carbohydrates, depending on whether you're eating a half to a full cup of root vegetables. Some of these root vegetables have more carbohydrate content than others, and these things are very easy to find out on the internet. Like, you can just simply go to Google and say how many carbs in a half cup of carrots, and it will give you a number right on the search page. So again, information at the fingertips. But these are favorable starches like your roots and tubers, with the exception of your white potatoes. So very, very quickly, again, things like sweet potatoes or butternut squash or beets or carrots and turnips and rutabagas. These are things that are very favorable starches. Good fiber content, doesn't hit your blood sugar too badly, especially if you're not eating very large amounts. So I want to make sure that you're paying attention to the serving sizes here. It's a half to a full cup. And if you put that in a measuring cup and then put it on your plate, you're going to go, wow, that's actually not a lot. And it's far less than I'm used to eating. And that's just kind of the way it is. We tend to overemphasize these starchy carbohydrates, even sometimes the favorable ones. So if our target is somewhere between 100 to 125 grams of carbohydrates for the day as a beginning and a starting point, this is very easy for us to get. So you might want to take note of this. And again, we'll be coaching you in the one-on-one sessions. Well, let's talk about fats now as the final macronutrient. We're just going to very simply categorize them as good fats and bad fats. In fact, there was a great book that was published probably about 10 years ago now called something like that, Good Fats and Bad Fats. And unfortunately, fats have been demonized in popular media and news outlets for many, many years. And they've gotten a lot of stuff wrong. There's been a lot of 180-degree turns in terms of attitudes and what's being published on these things over the last several years. So here's where I want you to be for right now. We want to emphasize things like monounsaturated fats. These are the ones that are more favorable for healthy hearts, etc. And they would be things like extra virgin olive oil. Go for the cold pressed varieties. Spend a little bit extra money just to get the good quality stuff. It will be well worth it. Then we have things like coconut oil, avocado, or oil from avocados. And there's something called ghee. Ghee is It's the fat droplet portion of dairy. You can get this also from coconut. And the interesting thing here is that it has all the milk proteins taken out of it. So people who have dairy sensitivities quite often can tolerate ghee. Now, again, not everyone can, or not everyone does, because you can actually even have sensitivities to the fat droplets. But ghee is a potential option, even if you have a dairy sensitivity. But these days, because we have such a wide variety of alternative products out there, you can get coconut ghee as well. And these things are used very, very well used for cooking and preparing foods, used in recipes, that kind of thing. And yes, on the bottom, even saturated fats, things like, believe it or not, bacon fat, lard. I'm not going to go into all the science here. If you want to chase it down on your own, all you have to do is go to Google again and put in a search term something like, is bacon fat bad for you? Now, you're going to get some dissenting views, but the largest portion of research, especially coming out of groups that are into what we call ancestral health or ancestral eating, really there's a lot of information that says that these saturated fats, which have been demonized in the past, are not the bad guys that we thought they were. And in fact, they actually have some health promoting things. So I personally have no problem if you want to retain some bacon grease and fry some food in that, or if you want to buy some duck fat, or even if you want to use lard in some of your cooking. Now, on the bad fat side, polyunsaturated fats, the big things I want you to be aware of are the vegetable fats, the things like Crisco or canola oil. These things are actually what are called omega-6 fatty acids. These are bad for you. We want to stay away from trans fats, hydrogenated fats. In fact, if the word trans fats, hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated are on the label of something, put it back. Do not put it in your shopping cart, because these things are well known to change cell membrane fluidity. It actually changes you at your cellular level, and these are very bad for you. And we certainly don't want anything from a GMO or genetically modified source. Now, I know that that's a very quick flyby, but believe me, this is one section where we could spend hours just talking about this. And what I'm trying to do is create a big picture and give you a framework, and then you can hunt down some details on your own, and we can give you some more direction and guidance on our one-on-one sessions. But talking about fats, don't fear the fat. Fat doesn't actually make you fat. Really, too many carbohydrates, too many calories from any source will do that. And as long as your carbs are controlled, and as long as you're in that sweet spot, wherever that is for you, your fats are predominantly used as a more alternative fuel. Also, your cell structures, we mentioned before, and even for joint lubrication. How much fat do you need? Well, I have some guidelines here. And again, these are just simply guidelines. And these are most active women and most active men. Your needs may be a little bit less than that. And that's somewhere for most active women between 50 and 75 grams per day spread across all of the different times that you feed. Another way to do it would be to take your total daily caloric needs and subtract how many calories you're getting for protein, how many calories you're getting from carbohydrates, and then whatever is left over you account for by your fat intake. So that would just be a very simple way to do it. Now, if you're going to try to do it that way, and you certainly can, here's some guidelines in terms of the science between or behind how many calories are in a gram of protein or carbohydrates or fat. And you'll see that fats are what we call calorie dense. They have a little more than twice the number of calories per gram than your proteins and your carbohydrates do. So for example, if I'm eating 10 grams of protein, that's going to give me 40 calories. But if I eat 10 grams of fat, that's going to give me 90 calories. So you'll notice for most diet prescriptions, so to speak, the number of grams of fat are typically quite a bit less or lower than the number of protein and carbohydrate grams. And again, that's just because of the science between how each of these different macronutrients contribute to your energy levels. Now, what about calculating your BMR and total calories? Because you can drive yourself crazy trying to figure out all these little formulas. Easiest thing to do is to go to myfitnesspal.com. There are other websites out there. We like this one because it dovetails with our technology. But myfitnesspal.com will do the calculations for you. And what I would like you to do is, if you don't have an account, just go to their website today. We'll provide a link on the same page that this video is on. All you have to do is just click the link and open a free account. And then it will ask you to put in some body measurements, how tall you are, how old you are, your gender, that kind of thing. And it will calculate things like your BMR, your total daily calorie requirements. And what I want you to do is I want you to log your food for no less than 3 days. Now, I want to be real clear. I am not a fan of calorie counting. I think in the long run, it's more detrimental because you tend to micromanage and obsess over things that are just estimates anyways. But in the beginning, especially if you don't know what your caloric intake is or you don't know what your target is, how do you know if you're even close? How do you know if you're overeating or undereating? And as I mentioned before, you can't use whether or not you've got excess body weight as an indication of whether you're overeating, because you may have these metabolic challenges and you may have changed your metabolic set point by underfeeding. So I want you to log your food for no less than 3 days, and then our staff will be communicating with you just to give you some feedback on, here's your target, here's where you are, here's how we think you should manipulate your diet, add a little bit of this, take away a little bit of that, just to make sure that we're starting to use diet as a tool, because that for us right now is really what it is. And then once you get an idea of where you are, then you can learn how to eyeball things, because I don't want you to have to weigh and measure food and count calories all the time. But again, as an initial exercise, it's very valuable for you. It's very valuable for us in giving you the feedback that you need to, again, make the changes. And periodically, you might want to go back maybe every month or so and just recheck just to make sure that you're still in the same ballpark. This is something that's very interesting because the studies show us that calorie counting is an inexact science, and that you may sit down and say, okay, I just ate 28 grams of protein. You could be off by as much as 30% high or low. So knowing that, and knowing that this is an inexact science, is as much a reason for us to not be micromanaging calorie counters all the time. But again, as a tool, as a ballpark, as an estimate and a guideline, this is really what we want to be doing. So let's go into the core four now. We've already talked about how much you eat, and your total daily requirements are based on your age, your gender, your height, your weight, and your muscle mass, your basal metabolic rate, and then your activity levels. So let's go and talk a little bit more about how much is enough. What we're aiming for is enough food to support function and muscle mass, but not enough to accumulate excess body fat. Now, some people want to maintain their body weight where it is. They just want to change their body composition. So maybe I lose 5 pounds of fat, but I gain 5 pounds of muscle. My total weight doesn't change, but my body composition does. Your wellness will change as a result of that. But a lot of our clients do want to shed some body weight, but we want to make sure that they're losing fat and not muscle. So we have to feed the muscle, and we want to burn the fat. And this is really a balancing act, and why it's important for us to try to start getting this right from the beginning. So here's the exercise that I want you to do. And again, we're going to give you some links and some guidance down below. But I want you to go to myfitnesspal.com and use their tools to calculate your BMR and your estimated total caloric needs. Now, you're going to estimate the total caloric needs based on what your activity factor is. Now, what is the activity factor? Well, the activity factor is a multiplier that we apply to your basal metabolic rate to determine how much you need, not just lying in bed, but how much you need to get up and clean your house, do your laundry, take care of your kids, go to work, bale the hay, work in your yard, whatever it is your daily routine is, whether it's sitting in an office as an executive or whether it's, taking care of a herd of cats or kids at home. It doesn't really matter. You're expending energy doing something. And the more energy you're expending, the more muscle mass you have, the higher your BMR is to begin with. That changes what your caloric needs are. So myfitnesspal.com will help you calculate those. But if you want to do a very quick calculation and get your BMR, what you can do is use this chart and these correction factors in the right-hand column to get a rough estimate of where your calories will be. Now, this is like where you have to be really brutally honest with yourself. There is a tendency to overestimate our activity levels, and we're all guilty of it. It's a generalist tendency. So I want you to pause and reflect for just a moment before you say, oh, I'm a moderate activity person. Because you might be going to the gym 3 days a week, but if you're sitting around socializing, reading magazines while you're walking very slowly on a treadmill, that's not metabolically active. What we're talking about here, whether it's light activity or moderate activity, when you're in the gym, you're focused and you're intentional and you're not taking long breaks and you're expending a fair amount of energy. So just take a moment and look at this and just kind of peg where you are. I will tell you that we have a lot of clients who come to us and they're sedentary because they either have never developed a habit of exercise and activity, or maybe they have, but their metabolic state is to the point where they can't exercise. And there are some circumstances where we have asked people to stop exercising until we can help balance their physiology, and then we get them back into an activity program again. So whether you're currently active or not doesn't really matter. We just need to know where you are. But I will tell you that over time, no matter what your starting point is, we want you in the moderate activity zone. This is where the research is really clear for us that it is moderately intense activity 3 to 4 days a week that is going to give us all the benefits of exercise that everybody is looking for. Now, as a general rule, and we'll cover this in another lesson in what we call the Core 4 exercise program, there's a general principle that all exercise is good, and certainly any exercise is better than none. But there are some ways and methodologies of exercising, or exercise techniques, if you will, that are far superior to others in terms of creating the metabolic change that we're looking for. Now, I'm not going to ask you if you're sedentary or if you're exercising and it hurts and you feel worse afterwards. I'm not going to ask you to jump into a moderate program. We're going to meet you where you are, and then we're going to teach you what you need to know, and then we're going to bring you up to the point where you're actually using exercise as a tool, just like we're trying to teach you to use diet as a tool. Okay, that's equally important for us. Now, if you want to go beyond that, great. If you want to become an ultra athlete, perfect. But over time, let's focus on the moderate activity level. Now, remember, these are just guidelines, right? Estimates are 30% off high or low. This is a ballpark. It's a starting point. We're going to have to tweak it over time. So don't obsess about the numbers. But on the other hand, the numbers are important, right? Don't slough them off either. And don't decide to not go through this exercise of trying to figure out what your BMR and total caloric intake is. Now, once you get those calculations done, I want you to share them with us. You can send them through the secure messaging portal, send them to our staff, and then when we get to doing your individual sessions, then we'll talk about, okay, here's where you are, here are the adaptations or changes you need to make. So we've been talking about total calories, but what about each individual meal? That's important as well, because you can just eat way too much or way too little at one particular time. And what I want to do is give you just a couple of eyeball methods so that when you get finished with counting calories for a few days, just to give us that initial feedback, you've got another methodology that's going to help you figure out how much food you need. So the first thing is going to be what we call the hand method. And this is not my invention. This has been around for quite a long time. But when it comes to proteins, your lean protein and fish, you want to aim for something that's about the size and thickness of the palm of your hand. Of course, depending on how large you are, your hand may be bigger or smaller, and that fits because if you are a bigger person with bigger hands, you probably have more muscle, and therefore you're going to need more protein, especially if you're physically active. And if you're smaller and more petite, then you're going to need less. So we're going to use the size of your hand as a general guideline. So at any particular meal, you should be consuming about enough protein to match the size of your hand. Now, in terms of carbohydrates, meaning predominantly your greens and your non-starchy vegetables, we want to use the size of 2 cupped handfuls. Imagine that your hands are big salad scoops, and you've got a huge bowl of leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables, and you reach in with your hands and you grab what you can with those 2 hands and put it on your plate. And that's going to fit out to be, maybe about 2/3 of your plate, as long as you're not scrunching it down. You just kind of lay it down, and then it's going to take up maybe 2/3 of your plate. Or you could say maybe the size of 2 fists. For example, if you're using broccoli or cauliflower, that kind of thing that maybe conforms to that shape, you can look at the size of your fists. And if you do choose to have the favorable starches, as we talked about before, make sure that you are controlling the portion size and treat them more like condiments rather than a main source of your primary carbohydrates. Remember, we're shooting for a certain amount of carbs throughout the day, and you can get pretty much what you need by leafy greens, non-starchies, a little bit of fruit and berries, and if you have to, a little tiny serving of those favorable starches. And then finally, when it comes to fats, you can use your thumb as a guide. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a funky one. In the beginning, we don't want you to be having nuts and seeds, but at some point, nuts and seeds may be okay for you. And then maybe 4 or 5 almonds would be about the size of your thumb, or maybe a slice of avocado would fit that, or maybe a drizzle of olive oil. And again, because they're calorie dense, you don't need quite so much as your leafy greens, which are not calorie dense, but they are nutrient dense. And certainly not as many calories, proteins are not as calorie dense. So you don't need quite as much fat. And so the portion size is going to be quite a bit smaller. And again, these are estimates, these are guidelines, but it's an eyeball method that will alleviate the need to continue to count calories. Now, there is a second method, and this is the plate method. And in general, and this graphic isn't precise, this is just to illustrate the concept. We want to make sure that the largest portion of your plate is made up of leafy greens, followed by the next largest portion being your lean proteins, and then the next portions being your healthy fats. And again, if you have favorable carbs, they are a much smaller portion, right? So you can take your dinner plate and you can divide it into 2/3, maybe 1/4, and then the next quarter being your healthy fats and your favorable carbohydrates. So hopefully that's a good guideline for you. And remember, this is a work in progress. Let's talk now about, in terms of quantity, the most common mistakes we see our clients making. The first one is that calories come too low. And this is very easy to do when you're dropping out grains and starches and other carbohydrates. It is very, very easy for your calories to drop too low, sometimes even below your basal metabolic rate, without even realizing it. And in that case, what we want to do is what we call a HEC check. Now, again, this is not my invention. I stole this from another doctor. And HEC stands for hormones, energy, and cravings. And now we're going to throw in brain on that as well, because we said calories too low, carbs too low. Sometimes your brain doesn't work well. And that would be the second mistake, would be carbs are too low. But with the HEC check, when your calories are too low, hormones tend to not work. So we'll see things like hot flashes, and you may get nervous or anxiety attacks. We may see energy drop down. You may crave a lot more. That would be a sign that your total calories are low. The other thing that we can see with that is we can see like crazy weight loss. And sometimes that's okay. And I'll tell you this, if your brain's working and your energy is good and you're rapidly losing weight, I'm okay with that. But if you're losing lots of weight, and you might be happy with the weight loss, but if your brain's not working, the energy is not working, then something's not working. We need to fix that, right? So we may have to sacrifice how rapidly you lose weight if that's one of your goals and needs to happen. We may have to sacrifice how fast that happens for the sake of maintaining functionality. And this is one of the reasons why we have our individual sessions, to make sure that we're going through all of these things and managing that process. Now, the second most common mistake, as we have on the screen here, is carbohydrates are too low. And we focused on this already, but brain fog, focus, and concentration can go down. And for some people, we may have to get their carbs up until their brain kicks in again. But again, this is part of the work in progress and the consultation process. So let's move on to the second part of our core 4 now, which is talking about food quality. Now, there's a huge move over the last several years to eat organic and have hormone and antibiotic-free meats. And as we will talk about in another lesson on detoxification and the environment we live in, if you're going to spend any money in your grocery budget and divert it to cleaner stuff, I would prefer that you eat clean meats and fish rather than going for organic fruits and vegetables. And the reason for that is there's a lot more variability in clean fruits and vegetables that you can get at your regular health food store without having to pay a lot of extra money. Whereas we know for sure that the hormones and the antibiotics that are used to grow animals fat and big and very quickly stay in the meat and has an impact on our physiology. Now, this is an area where I want you to shoot for progress, not perfection, because not everybody can afford to spend their whole paycheck at Whole Foods. And granted, it does cost more money to buy clean meats and fish and buy organic. So I want to give you some of these guidelines. Eat clean meat and fish if you can afford it. And if you can't afford to eat everything that way, maybe half of what you eat is that. So just make one step in the right direction. And over time, maybe you can make those decisions and divert more resources. When it comes down to vegetables, I want you to eat fresh stuff. And in fact, I don't think you can beat local organic produce if you can find it. Now, maybe you can't, and if you can't, then fresh frozen vegetables work fairly well, and we certainly consume plenty of that in our household. But we also try to abide by what's called the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. And this comes to us from something called the Environmental Working Group. And you go to their website, ewg.org, and you can download this graphic. In fact, if you give them like a $5 or $10 donation, they'll send you like a little card with this that you can stick in your purse or in your daytimer if you carry one of those. But here's the concept. When research and environmental groups look at pesticides in food, some foods soak up more pesticides and junk and chemicals than others. And so the Clean 15 are things that you're probably safe buying in your standard grocery store. So you don't have to worry necessarily about going organic with the Clean 15. And that's great because these tend to be a little less expensive than their organic counterparts. However, the Dirty Dozen, according to the research, are the foods that tend to soak up pesticides and retain them so that when you bring them home, yeah, you might wash the outside, but they're inside this stuff. And so you consume it and you're consuming pesticides. Now, granted, we're exposed to stuff everywhere, but sometimes it's about minimizing the exposure. And one of the ways and strategies you can do to improve the quality of your food is to start sourcing a portion of your animal proteins from clean sources and starting to pay attention to what should I buy organically from a produce, a fruit and vegetable standpoint, and what can I get away buying regular non-organic, all right? And that might help you make some decisions. But check out EWG, the Environmental Working Group, contribute a lot to our understanding of how the environment is changing, how it has changed, how it's affected our food supply, and even chemicals that we use in our home. They do quite a bit of research. They're a good watchdog and advocacy group, and I would suggest that you go and check out their website just for some more information. So we've talked about quantity, we've talked about quality. Let's talk about timing and frequency. I know I grew up in an era where it was 3 square meals a day. And of course, we came home from school and we were starving, so we usually had a snack after we got home and before dinner. But probably in the last, easily 20 years, the mantra in the nutrition and health and wellness industry has been 5 to 6 small meals spread evenly throughout the day. Whether those are equal sized and portioned meals or maybe 3 larger meals and 2 snacks, that's a personal choice. And that works well for a lot of people, especially if you tend to have a low blood sugar scenario. But it doesn't work for everyone. And in fact, I am one of those people. I have inherited my mother's family's genetics. We have a lot of diabetics on that side of the family. And if I don't eat properly and eat according to my physiology and uniqueness, and if I don't exercise, I can't control my blood sugar. I would be someone who would probably become a diabetic if I let that happen. So I have learned over the years that even with good exercise, if I eat 5 to 6 small meals a day and I'm constantly eating the food every few hours, I can't control my blood sugar. So for me, it's better to delay eating and have longer periods of time in between. Now that strategy is not going to work for someone else. And this is where we really have to start dialing in your strategy and your unique food code, so to speak. And in this case, we want to base our timing and frequency on your blood sugar pattern. Now, we're going to derive this not just from symptomatology, but from your lab work as well. And depending on when you're listening to this particular lecture, you may already have your blood sugar pattern. You may know what that is. You may not. So just hang with me for a moment. We're going to divide it just very neatly between low blood sugar on the left and high blood sugar on the right, what we call reactive hypoglycemia and insulin resistance. And I'm going to give you the rules very quickly as an overview, and more detailed explanations can happen in the individual sessions. But here's the rules for eating if you happen to have a low blood sugar reactive hypoglycemia profile. The first thing is you can never skip meals. The problem is low fuel, and every time you skip meals, your body reacts, and specifically your brain reacts by creating a fight or flight or a stress response. It actually taxes your adrenals, and there's a whole cascade of things that happen after that. So it's very important to not skip meals. And it's also probably primarily important to make sure that you have breakfast within 30 minutes of getting out of bed. That means that you're going to break your fast because you've had no food throughout the night. and you get up and you fuel your system within 30 minutes. This is actually critically important. Now, we'll explain why and how later if we need to, but sometimes people with this pattern wake up and they're not hungry. Sometimes they're actually nauseous, and they wait until hours later to eat until their stomach settles down, and that's a mistake. You have to get in the habit of eating whether you're hungry or not, whether you're nauseous or not. And again, we'll explain why in individual sessions if we need to. There usually has to be a big diet change, and again, if you're following our paleo starting point, you're going to be focusing on lean meats and fish and de-emphasizing the carbohydrates. But the big thing with people who have reactive hypoglycemia is to make sure that they're not eating junky stuff. Things with higher sugar levels, things that are convenient, tend to sky your blood sugar high, and then it plummets and it drops, and then there's a crash that comes after that. And that has to be avoided at all costs. And people with this pattern quite often have to eat every couple of hours. And this is where that 5 to 6 smaller meals spread throughout the day typically works very well with someone who has this kind of pattern, because they struggle with inconsistent or low fuel states. And we can fix that by increasing the frequency of feedings and making sure that we're paying attention to the content and the quality of the foods. And then finally, we have to have zero tolerance for these low blood sugar episodes. And so your version, if you have this, may vary somewhat, but typically people with this pattern, if they wait too long to eat or skip a meal, they'll get some version of shaky, irritable, lightheaded, fatigue, a headache, moodiness, and then they eat and they feel better. Well, that's the body reacting to a low fuel state by creating a stress response. And there is, as I mentioned a moment ago, a cascade of undesirable effects that are associated with that. So we need to stay ahead of that. We need to make sure that you're feeding yourself frequently enough that you avert those. You don't wait until the symptoms happens and then react. You have to eat proactively. And again, it doesn't matter if you're hungry or not. You're fueling your system and you're eating for function first and foremost until we can correct these scenarios. Now, on the flip side, on the high blood sugar side, we have, again, a whole bunch of rules. The first thing is to know your carbohydrate tolerance and stay under it. Typically, people with insulin resistance need way fewer carbohydrates, and I'd say even fewer calories than what they're used to eating. Now, let's talk about carb tolerance. Basically, we all have a certain ability to metabolize carbohydrates. Some of us can handle more, some handle quite a bit less. But you know that you've blown through your carbohydrate tolerance when you eat and you get tired, or you eat and you need some kind of a stimulant like coffee or chocolate, or you eat and you want sweets. So post-meal fatigue and cravings for either sweets or stimulants is a sign that you've consumed too many carbohydrates and you have a problem with this insulin resistance pattern. So we need to make sure that we're paying attention to what your threshold levels are, what your total calories are. Sugars and starches are the enemy. So again, we're going to de-emphasize those and emphasize the balance as we've been talking about with the paleo approach. We're not going to go through that again because we've just done it. And we need to pay attention to this guy called fructose. Now, fructose is found naturally in fruit. And it's not that fructose in and of itself is bad. Again, sometimes it's how much you have. And so if you're following the guidelines of just a couple of pieces of fruit and maybe some berries every day, you should be coming underneath our tolerance level of, say, 25 grams of fructose per day. Higher than that, it tends to promote insulin resistance. It promotes body fat accumulation. It drives up your triglycerides. Fructose, and in particular high fructose corn syrup, which we want zero tolerance for. High fructose corn syrup has been shown in medical research to be diabetogenic. It can cause diabetes. All you have to do is go to the grocery store, pick something off the shelf at random, and chances are there's high fructose corn syrup in it. It's very cheap to make, it's very sweet, it makes things taste great, but it causes diabetes. All right, so we want to stay away from that. So fructose from fruit sources, let's limit that. And no products, no prepared and packaged foods with high fructose corn syrup. And then we might want to consider intermittent fasting. I'm not going to go into the details here, but sometimes kind of like my profile, where I actually control my blood sugar and function better if I eat less frequently. I still eat enough. I still pay attention to my carbohydrate tolerance, but I eat less frequently. Sometimes intermittent fasting, where you go longer periods of time and eat your food in a shorter window rather than throughout the entire day, that can be quite advantageous. And there's a tremendous amount of research coming out. Now, I have to caution you, if you have reactive hypoglycemia, intermittent fasting may not work for you, particularly in the beginning when your blood sugar levels in control are very unstable. Stay away from that for now. But if you're on the high blood sugar side, intermittent fasting could be a tool that you use in the short term and actually can be adopted as a lifestyle. And again, if that's something that we find value in, we'll end up talking about that in the individual coaching sessions. So there's your timing and frequency. It really is about your blood sugar control. There is no one size fits all. We got to figure out what works for you. All right, let's talk about our final thing here, which is motivation. I think that we've probably all experienced different portions of this. The first problem area we want to talk about in terms of motivation is what we call distracted eating. And this has actually been studied in psychology research and published in journals. And what they do is they look at people who, say, eat food while they're working, or they eat food while they're watching TV or movies. And because your brain is occupied doing other things and you're eating, your brain has a decreased perception of flavor, like sweet, sour, and salty. And so it actually takes more food, more quantity, to get the same level of satisfaction. And the studies tell us that people who eat while they're distracted consume 10% more calories at the time they're eating and consume 25% more calories during that day. And that can lead to, quite a bit of problems, especially if you're choosing high calorie snacks like nuts, for example, or buttered popcorn if you're watching a movie. So that those things can actually be devastating. So make sure that when you're eating, you're not doing other things. You need to control the environment so that you're focused on the food. Actually pause, think, pray, meditate, do whatever you need to, and then appreciate the food that you're eating. Chew it, feel the texture, experience the flavors, and be aware and be mindful of what you're doing. You can actually cut calories and control eating very, very easily that way. Now, that kind of leads us into stress and emotional eating. And again, this is a very common problem, especially when we're dealing with clients who have metabolic problems that may dovetail into stress handling or adrenal responses. The first thing is to recognize that you're doing it, right? Awareness is the first step to recovery. And so recognize when you're doing it and try to learn to identify the triggers, whether the trigger is stress at work or stress at home or an event or an environment. It doesn't really matter. If you can identify the trigger and then recognize the behavior, then what you can do is you can do what we call take 5. And that means just pause and really ask yourself, why are you eating? Are you truly hungry, or are you eating out of this stress and emotional response? Now, the problem here is that if you are stress eating, you've probably done it so much that you do it without thinking. And you may know that you've done it afterwards, but as you're actually reaching for whatever it is, whatever your poison is, you don't know you're doing it. It's like a stimulus response, and there's no gap in between. What you have to do is start to recognize that you have a choice in that infinitesimally small moment where you have a trigger. You have a choice to either stress eat or not. So my suggestion is start working on recognizing your triggers so that you can go, okay, do I really need to do this? Do I want to do this? And if I'm going to eat, is it the right choice? So maybe instead of reaching for a bag of crackers or popcorn or something that's really not good for you, maybe you reach for some celery. And I'm just making some things up for the moment here. If this is a problem, bring it up in your consulting session so we can coach you through this and give you some options. But we've had clients do things like this. They'll take 5, they'll walk away from the fridge or the cupboard, they'll go outside, they'll take their dog out, they'll go read a book. I've had clients do some air squats or do some sit-ups or some push-ups. They'll actually do some physical activity. And after a few minutes, these cravings and these triggers tend to have less control. Now, this is a learned behavior. Stress and emotional eating, you learn to do that. You can unlearn it. It may be difficult, it may take some time, but you can unlearn it, and you can learn to replace that either with no eating at all, especially if it's just cravings and not true hunger, or you can learn to replace that with healthier options and healthier choices. So problem area number 1, distracted eating. Problem area number 2, stress and emotional eating. Problem area number 3 would be imbalances in the hormones that control hunger and satiety. So your drive for food, your perception of your need for food that we'll call hunger, as well as your perception of whether you're full and that signal that says stop eating. These are hormonally based and they're driven through your brain. So let me give you just a real quick biochemistry lesson here. Leptin is made by your body fat cells in response to eating. So when you eat, as you eat enough calories, your leptin levels go up. They affect a part of your brain called the hypothalamus, and that is where your satiety signal is. So when this is working well, I start out hungry, I eat food, I eat enough food, and then the leptin signals up into my brain, says, hey, you're full, you need to stop. And so I can push my plate away and say, well, I'm full, I don't need to eat anymore. Ghrelin is made by your gut. It's made in your intestines, and it drives hunger signaling. So these counterbalance each other. One drives satiety, one drives hunger. And with ghrelin levels rise or should rise when you haven't eaten for a while. And this is part of what drives you to seek out food. But what happens when you have metabolic issues, when you're infected and inflamed and stressed and all the things we tend to see in our clients, is that leptin signaling doesn't work, so we don't know when we're full, and there's a tendency for some people to keep eating even though they've had enough calories. And ghrelin doesn't shut down, so you end up thinking you're hungry when you've already actually satisfied your food requirements. So these things can get very out of balance, but I'll tell you that these are a result and a consequence of the metabolic issues. If this is a problem for you, the way to fix it is to fix all of the metabolic issues that we're identifying through our testing and we'll be working on through your program. And then this dovetails into the final motivation is that, why are you eating? Are you truly hungry? Is there a physiological need for food, or do you have cravings? Or are you eating out of habit? Or are you eating because you're stressed, right? And this is kind of part of what we've already been talking about. And sometimes you don't know the difference between the two. And how do you know? Well, sometimes you just need to walk away and just take a few minutes and just ask yourself, is this really a physiological need? When was the last time I ate? How much do I need? Is it my first meal of the day? Is it my third meal? Where am I? What's the context? And so again, being mindful and being intentional. Diet and food right now for you is a tool, and it's a tool that we're trying to use to affect a specific change. And so in terms of your motivation for eating, right now, you should be eating for fuel and function first and foremost. That is your primary job when it comes to food right now. And eating for pleasure has to take a second seat. But the good news is right now is that they don't have to be incompatible. Years ago, before, say, the paleo world exploded, if you were to eat kind of this way, you kind of had to put up with eating the same foods over and over again. Well, you don't have to, particularly if you're even halfway decent at shopping appropriately and then preparing with recipes. And so we have clients asking us all the time, like, I need recipes, I need ideas. Well, down below here, I'm going to provide a link for you to a website called Real Plans. And this has been one of my greatest discoveries over the last year or so. This is a website, and it actually is a subscription service, but it's very inexpensive, especially if you pay for the year in advance. It's like $6 a month, $5 a month, something like that. And this is an online meal planner and recipe box that you can tell the system, hey, I'm gluten-free, I'm dairy-free, I don't have grains, I don't eat nightshades, and it will filter out all the recipes in its database. And they have thousands and thousands of recipes, and they're all like scrumptious and delicious, and a lot of them are put together by like very high-qualified professional chefs. And so what they do is they filter out all the recipes that don't match your dietary lifestyle, and then you basically pick and choose, and you can create a meal plan based around the guidelines that I've given you. And once you decide what you want, then you can set up, you can even go so far as to go 2 weeks out, and you can plan your meals 2 weeks in advance, and the system will create a shopping list for you. You can download it to your smartphone, you can take it to the grocery store, you can have your shopping list with you that are specifically tailored to the meals that you're going to make that day or that week. And as you put things in your grocery cart, you can click it off your list, and you know you're going to get everything that you need. I want to try to give you as many tools as possible without you being completely reliant on me to provide these things, right? This is about you learning and taking control. And sometimes technology can be your best friend. So make sure that you check it out and click the link that's going to be below this video on the same page where you're watching this. and check them out. I highly recommend it. We use this at home, and the staff use this, and we've just found tremendous benefit in it. Now, going on here, learn not to use food as comfort or stress control. Substitute healthier behaviors. So we've talked about that already. Now, 2 more things before we do our summary and we let you go for today. Let's talk about fiber and water. Fiber, critically important. Again, if you're following our recommendations, you should be getting plenty of fiber. That amounts to 25 to 35 grams per day spread out over all of your different meals. Now, some people are coming from a low fiber diet, and they end up increasing their diet, and sometimes their bowel habits improve dramatically. Sometimes they get worse. So sometimes you might have to dial back on the plant and vegetable matter just a little bit. Sometimes it's a hydration issue. So we kind of need to balance these two out. And as you start to eat more, if you're not used to eating as much vegetation, pay attention to what's happening with your bowel habits. Again, give us the feedback in your coaching sessions. But for you, for right now, if that's happening, if you're seeing that you're kind of stopping up and you've got low gut motility and things aren't coming out the way they should, you might dial back a little bit on the vegetation, but make sure that you're drinking plenty of water. Now, as a general guideline, you should be drinking 50% of your total body weight, not your lean body mass, but your total body weight in ounces of water. So if you weigh 160 pounds, you should be drinking 80 ounces of water, and other liquids do not count. And you should be drinking predominantly water now anyways. If you are physically active, if you're working outdoors, if you're sweating a lot, you're going to need to drink more. How much? I don't know, because we don't know what your activity levels are. But at the very least, let's aim for 50% of your body weight in ounces. Now, one final warning here, you can overhydrate. You can drink too much, and you can actually dilute your electrolytes so much that you can end up in the hospital. And we've seen a couple of clients do that. Now, they tend to be very small, very frail, and in an effort to try to hydrate, they just take in too much. But we'll be able to pick it up on labs. If you're feeling worse, just make sure you're doing this check. 50% of your body weight in ounces, let's stick with that. And if you have additional demand with exercise and sweating and working, then we can compensate that way. All right, so here's your quick summary now. We talked about content. We did a very quick Paleo Quick Start reminder. Go back to your reference materials if you need to review those things. We talked about quantity and doing your BMR calculations using myfitnesspal.com to do the math and to do the work for you. But remember, how much you need is dependent on your lean body mass, your muscle mass in essence, plus your activity levels. We talked about quality, and we said, let's focus on clean meats as well as the clean 15 and dirty dozen. And if you don't have the financial wherewithal just to do it all, just aim for progress. Don't worry about perfection. Just do a little bit, do what you can. Start making a distinction between some organic things, some clean meats and fish, and then just take one step forward. Talked about frequency and timing of food and cross-checking that with your blood sugar pattern. And then we talked about your motivation for eating, making sure that you're eating for fuel and function first. But as we talked about, we don't have to sacrifice flavor and pleasure. And if you find yourself eating the same foods over and over again, forgive me for saying it this way, it's probably your fault. You need some creativity, you need some resources, and this is where the real plan system can come in for you. Now, next session in the diet series, we're going to be talking about food sensitivities. We'll talk about the testing that's available out there. We don't do food sensitivity testing with all of our clients. We'll explain why and what the problems are with most of the food sensitivity testing technologies. And then we'll lay out the elimination provocation strategy. Now, usually we don't do that lesson until a little bit down the road. We want to cover a couple of lessons in other aspects of the unique wellness paradigm before we get there. But we'll make sure that we get that lesson to you, and we'll guide you through that process. So, final reminder, you are unique. Your doctor should be taking care of you that way. We'll talk to you again soon.